In 1968, the Hays Code was abolished, allowing films to take storylines to darker places. Movies began to show more violence, more crime, and ambiguous moral conclusions. And behind this slick neon lighting and film grain was a backbone built from the cynicism of 1940s film noir. All of that led to a genre that's still going strong today. Neo-noir is the first thing that comes to mind when I play Void Interactive's Ready or Not. The distant police sirens, heavy rainstorms, shadowy nights, and painfully bright sunlight bring a sense of a world slightly elevated, slightly more saturated, but also slightly darker. Los Suenos is the name of your home, and things are a little more than realistic. The music of this game screams neo-noir with their pulsing rhythms, clock ticks, and heartbeats, almost reminiscent of crime shows like Breaking Bad. Simultaneously intense and strangely classy, dangerous but formal, just as you are. With the tone set by its music, Ready or Not insists that it's a tactical shooter where you take on the role of a SWAT commander. With an in-depth arsenal, you're tasked with the exact same objective as old-school SWAT games. That objective is bringing order to chaos, whether it be a hostage situation, a crime ring takedown, or a terror attack. The game prides itself on being realistic and dark. There's a heavy focus on strategy and the movements before a fight rather than focusing on the fight itself, which more often than not starts off with you at a disadvantage. Equipment like breaching tools, door wedges, mirror guns, and grenades are essential. What most would say differentiates Ready or Not from other shooters of our current era is that killing isn't necessarily the goal. In most situations, the most rewarding course of action is defusing it non-lethally, forcing a suspect to comply and drop their gun so that we can arrest them. That of course isn't to say that the game doesn't involve its fair share of firefights. Ready or Not is controversial, and not necessarily for the reasons where it actively tries to be. For all its depictions of violence, depravity, and shock, what I find people online talking about the most is not the inclusion of these topics, but rather their presentation and their mechanics. And it's those two that I want to look into today. Before I begin, I would like to note that I'll try my best to minimize mention of SWAT 4, Ready or Not's most direct inspiration, unless it's a particular critique where I feel the comparison is relevant. I'd like to treat Ready or Not as more of its own game as much as it may take away from the old school shooter. I do, however, have many comparisons to make at the end. An opening level's job is to set a precedent, giving you room to experiment with the mechanics and showing how things are done, without being too overwhelming in difficulty. For Ready or Not, that map is the 4U gas station. The game gives you a phone which allows you to see your officer's loadouts, a briefing of the mission, a map of the area, and the 911 call that prompts your response. As with SWAT 4, your map isn't always going to be a reliable diagram. The map of the gas station is a hasty photograph of a blueprint, sure, but that depends entirely on information that would realistically be available to your department. Later levels in less familiar locations may have poorly scrawled plans on things like ripped cardboard boxes. The 911 call may not tell you much, but it provides a visceral setting of context for your task ahead, and it adds a human element to the civilians you may run into later on.
They started shooting!
Officers are on the way, sir. I need you to get somewhere safe, okay? And if you're able to, please tell me how many people you saw inside.
I'm in the back room. I'm not sure how many. I think...
Sir? Hello, sir?
No!
Are you there?
Hello!
Sir?
No!
The gas station's interior decoration is good, though some of it struggles when put up to scrutiny. The same applies for much of the game's decor, where some text doesn't really bother going into much detail when you look too close. Products have names like this, but it does also have its fair share of little details, such as notes left from one employee to another over at their lockers. A major strength of the gas station is its variation. The front of the station is an immediate challenge that forces some team coordination, splitting to the left and right with a little cover that divides the area up. The middle of the station allows for basic close quarters combat, its hallways and doors and rooms perfectly sized for a beginner to get used to gunfights and interactions in different spaces. The large diner section at the end is something of a final test, a large open area that might force long-range engagements. Then again, you could take a different path. There are multiple entrances on all sides of the station to approach from, letting you treat it as something of a beginner's sandbox. Your officer AI shows its capabilities in the very first room, where clearing a room shows blue and red pairs splitting in two to clear it. After all, a good SWAT game needs good AI for its officers, and I feel that Ready or Not succeeds in this aspect above all others. The system for giving your squad orders and their behavior is incredibly well performing when it's not suffering from bugs. Your squad will pie doors, move to make way for you in a stack, train their guns on the most ideal point to watch, move out of your way if they're in your line of fire, and are generally well performing in gunfights, even more so than real players. It is honestly really refreshing to have teammate AI that's actually really competent. Seeing their autonomy and logic is easily one of the game's most impressive aspects. All of that, not to mention the fact that after all suspects have been detained, the game adds a feature that lets the AI spread out to search and secure the rest of the area for you. The level introduces some side objectives that involve finding the 911 caller who's been killed before you arrive at the scene, his phone still lying next to him. His head is soaked in blood. It is a fittingly dark opener to a very dark game, and an immediate showcase that you won't be able to stop every crime, that people will still be killed. The other objective is finding a missing child who you find crying in a small corner in the middle of the map. Choosing to include this goal in the very first mission is a statement of sorts, one that attempts to resonate throughout the rest of the game. That being that the primary objective is not to take lives but to save them. How much of this rings true as the game goes on is up to debate. The gas station sets up the kind of visuals you're going to see throughout Los Suenos, with settings that are somewhat elevated while staying believable. There are moments where the environment is vibrant and colourful, but those settings are tainted, whether they be by fallen furniture, loose papers, or splattered bloodstains, showing the mundanity of civilian life disrupted by petty crime. The diner behind the station is retro-styled, its checkered tiles reflective in red. This shiny and decently clean area doesn't create the worst impression of Los Suenos, until you hear the petty robbers just barely out of high school talking about making it big, and see the people who've already been shot when you enter the building. You find a dead veteran and his dead dog, both shot. The veteran's gun has suffered a failed ejection, showing he tried to help the civilians inside until his firearm failed him. It's little vignettes like these that you piece together that made SWAT 4 so iconic, and Ready or Not makes it clear that it's following in that game's footsteps.
911, what is your emergency?
My name is Michael Williams. I'm currently in apartment 14 in the San Uriel condominiums with my piece of shit brother. I'm calling you because I've killed my mother. I'm going to kill my brother. And then I'm going to kill myself. So don't come in.
Okay, sir, stay with me. I would like to...
Don't tell me what to do!
The San Uriel condominiums are bright, and they're an immediate change from the gritty night atmosphere of the opening. At first glance, 23 Megabytes seems like it could be a simple swatting mission, and frankly I wish it was. The game had the opportunity to do something interesting by showing the impact of swatting, or maybe even having a lone crazed streamer like a mini version of SWAT 4's Fairfax Residence. Instead, what we get is incoherent. The simple 911 caller claims to be a streamer who's apparently killed his mom and is preparing to turn the weapon on himself. When we arrive at the scene, we stumble instead into a cryptocurrency server farm in another part of the building with a league of armed men dwelling within. While the presence of the men is hinted at in the briefing, their presence just seems odd and somewhat tacked on to enhance the difficulty for what could have easily been a single suspect mission. It may enhance the map gameplay-wise, but it creates this inconsistency and lack of cohesion that makes it very difficult to take the map seriously. We're led to believe that this streamer is running, or at least part of, the crypto farm, and if that was all he was, maybe I'd believe it. The thumbnail in the briefing evidence already says enough about how Ready or Not plans to depict this streamer. When you get to the apartment, the game abandons the little subtlety it has left and decides to shove in every stereotype you can find. Like many real streamers' apartments, his apartment is a gross mess, a disgusting hole filled with anime figurines and AI-generated posters. There's a fursuit hanging around in his bedroom and TVs are everywhere blasting mind-numbing music. Going to his bed with a body pillow on it, you can find that he's in possession of, well, illegal content depicting minors. As much as you could argue that this is believable, that it's realistic, there is a certain low-stakes humor in the situation with just how miserable this streamer's life is. And I can't help but feel that an opportunity was lost. This game is clearly willing to ask some moral questions, so it's somewhat odd that the walking incel stereotype isn't really given any depth, and instead reduced to a crypto-mining, anime-obsessed, furry P-word who runs a farm with a full-fledged gang on the side. Had the mission been a single suspect task that got rid of at least some of these inclusions, I feel like it would serve as a stronger and more believable scenario, maybe even as an opening level. As it is, the game doesn't really have any mission where you're genuinely mistaken in what you're doing or who you're dealing with. Ready or Not does have some moral ambiguity, but all your suspects are still criminals. It doesn't help that the phone call that brings you here is a swatting, and making the victim of it completely unsympathetic just doesn't feel very well thought out of or sensitive. Swatting is a very real and a very terrible thing, and turning the victim of it into a caricature is just a little off-putting. All of that is not to say that no effort was put in to depict this streamer. It may be exaggerated, but his setup does reflect a genuine way of living that's all too common. Simple hobbies turn into obsessions as merchandise piles up, a consequence of worshipping and fetishizing the material. You interrupt him mid-stream and the Twitch chat is vulgar and comically realistic, throwing out slurs and saying hi to you when you walk over to his setup and look at the webcam. Your officers might comment on the environment, which happens all throughout the game on rare occasions. I had one ask to 1 versus 1 over at the gaming setup, which was an appreciated detail. Something notable is that this is the first time the game forces you to handle a suspect non-lethally so that he can be taken in for questioning. Killing the streamer actually makes you fail your mission. It's a small but important reminder that your job isn't always to kill the bad guys, but merely to neutralize a situation as best as you can, and sometimes that involves non-lethal methods. It prevents you from going into his apartment guns blazing, suggesting you either use non-lethal weapons, a taser, or some other equipment to get him to drop his shotgun. The one thing that I believe this mission does nail is beginning something bigger. Ready or Not's missions are decently connected with a couple of storylines running parallel. 23 Megabytes is the beginning of this child exploitation story. Upon discovering the illegal content of minors, a musical motif begins to play, and while it does sound subdued, it most certainly indicates the presence of something unexpected. The coincidental discovery begins one of the game's darkest plotlines, and I do think it's a great way to introduce it. The rest of the apartment is fitting. While I find the map's story a little weak, its design is well done. There's a tutorial immediately embedded into the mission by discouraging you from using the main entrance. Walking in from there risks you getting shot from the 2 floors that overlook you. The game presents a very convenient side gate that takes you directly into one of the 2nd floor apartments, which teaches you about alternative approaches. Similarly to the gas station, there's a decent combination of open areas and cramped ones as you move from the apartment interiors to the outside hallways, where gaining line of sight may be harder. You'll still have to move in towards the overlook, which is one of the rare instances of vertical play, where the enemy has an advantage while you may struggle to figure out which floor they're firing from, possibly encouraging either staying in the rooms as much as possible or bringing a shield. Michael's apartment is where the difficulty starts to ramp up. A lot of suspects are normally barricaded in there, but so is Michael's younger brother and of course Michael himself, who you have to take alive. He's the first suspect in the game to wield a shotgun, making a traditional moving into his room more risky. Combine this with the heavy enemy count and you have the game gently encouraging you to make use of your utility. Flashes may work, but the layout of the apartment means that landing one may not be the most reliable. On the other hand, gas is a pretty good option for this level at the cost of a possible faceplate and utility that would otherwise be helpful for the rest of the map. And this feels very intentional. You can clear Michael's apartment reliably with gas, but it also means you should coordinate your team's loadouts, either editing the AI loadouts in single player or deciding who brings what in multiplayer. Some officers might bring gas for the apartment room, while others bring flashes, shields, or other forms of utility that may help in the more open areas. And it's this room for coordination and experimentation that makes teamwork in this game feel genuinely fun and, dare I say, tactical. The other apartments are sizable and livable, housing their own residents, though they look dusty and rarely cleaned. The sense of economic disparity in Los Suenos is not incredibly clear on this map just yet, but the next one will clear that up very quickly. Out of all the missions in Ready or Not, Twisted Nerve feels like the most consistent in terms of quality. Its atmosphere, setting, and story is perfectly believable and realistic, far more so than any other level. There's a police car sitting idly outside of this quiet neighborhood, indistinct radio chatter from the main menu playing, and the darkness that surrounds you is a reminder that you're closer to the city outskirts rather than its livelier center from the last two levels. There's a laundromat here that's been blocked off for asbestos. You used to be able to go inside to find meth, but the design's been streamlined and focused on the houses up on the hill. 213 Park homes are the site of methamphetamine production, though that wasn't their initial intent, of course. The homes were part of an affordable housing program and once housed a family, though that's not really a concern these people take into account as they cook and distribute. Twisted Nerve is dark, making it a classic gritty setting that sells that grounded feeling more than any other map. The map consists of two houses as well as tunnels you can find later on. This map is where the game really begins to show how good it can be. The close quarters areas are easy on a mechanical level, but the darkness and setting add a layer of tension that keeps you on your toes. For this mission in particular, I liked using the canted view, which is a great middle ground between hip firing and normal ADSing. There is an adrenaline rush during engagements here, and that heavy breathing and heartbeating stays with you even after a fight seems to be over. A lot of this is to do with how responsive enemies are. They'll react specifically based on where they're shot. Some will crumple up immediately and realistically, while others, high on adrenaline, will try to run for cover, still leaking blood, firing at you all the way. As much as the game is flawed, it's still one of the best depictions of these kinds of operations without needing to rely on scripted encounters. As famous as the House mission in Call of Duty was, it was a heavily narrative event that relied on pre-made moments. It was railroaded, this mission is not. The map is also deceptively large. Its tight quarters let more encounters fit inside of it. Though it looks like an abandoned few houses on the outside, the interiors are twisting and claustrophobic, with hallways looping around rooms that flank multiple sides, meaning that you can be sneaked up from behind from multiple angles. There are unexpected areas here that might catch players off guard, like the large attic of the second house above the meth lab, and the tunnels at the back of the house that lead to some incredibly tense encounters. And throughout the entire area is this sensation of both disgust and pity. With every room you go into, you're reminded that people live like this. The house is falling apart, everything is in disarray, items are scattered about. The wallpaper is peeling, there's a television sitting on the floor next to a mattress and a pizza box. You can see how living spaces have been repurposed into storage rooms and cooking stations for meth. One of the houses is completely covered with a tarp. This mission often has around 15 suspects, which is a pretty staggering increase from the last two, but it balances this out with the suspect AI. Even though they're dangerous hiding under beds and in corners, they rarely ever charge at you to overwhelm you, and they go down relatively quickly on account of being unarmored. This means shorter encounters, but also more of them. Part of me is almost sad that most people play the map with night vision, because taking off the goggles for a few moments shows just how well lit these environments can be. The glow of the lights casts shadows across all these rooms with a very film-like atmosphere while still varying itself with its light sources. The warm orange of the candles, the eerie green of the fluorescent lights, and the glowing blues from television screens all come together to prevent everything from blending into one another. When it comes to sound design, the house creaks often, whether it be from enemies' distant footsteps upstairs to just the poor architecture. The drug users you run into could be either suspects or civilians, and they don't really have a visual distinction. They could be completely harmless but delirious, and they could also run at you with a knife. In one bedroom is a disabled girl ODing on a bed next to a syringe. Strange and disturbing scrawlings on the wall indicate some sort of abuse. While many rooms have been repurposed, this girl's is nearly untouched, indicating that whoever her guardian was tried to maintain the illusion as long as they could, until the building fell into the hands of people who were far worse. The mission climax is the tunnel. It's located far back behind both houses, making it decently likely that you'll stumble upon it last. I was pretty surprised the first time I came across it, and I'm glad that I didn't know about it beforehand because it makes for what are oftentimes the best gunfights in the game. It's incredibly tight, dark, and unpredictable, but its layout allows for you to loop around and make sure you cover all ground. It feels like you're stumbling upon the last few suspects taking refuge from you inside, and it's a really memorable little area. The park homes are an incredibly well designed and well made location, having undergone many changes to refine it into what it is now. The city outskirts drug house is one of the staples of this kind of tactical shooter, and one of the situations that people think of when they think of SWAT. Fighting in these tight spaces is so claustrophobic that stepping outside truly makes me feel like taking a deep breath of fresh air, though as we find out many times later, it's still just an illusion. Despite being closer to the center of the city than the map before it, the row is the most glaring example of Los Suenos' economic struggles. You may hear a generic beat coming from one of many homeless shelters, a tarp closed over it to protect from the rain, with a sign outside protesting a veterans funding cut bill, the same bill you could find back at the gas station. There's a light rain that drizzles upon you, the day is cloudy dark like a storm's approaching. The name of the location you're pushing into is hastily scribbled on the building's initial logo, a poor and barely readable series of words that spells out Brixley Talent Time. This building is a former safe injection clinic turned talent agency run by George Brixley. Its interiors have been repurposed haphazardly, a flimsy illusion and weak excuse for something far worse. And yet, with the financial struggles this entire section of the city seems to be plagued by, it's sadly unsurprising how many remnants children have left behind here, from the handprints all over the walls to the photographs found in a disturbing little studio. The contrast between innocent children's toys and imagery with this decrepit little clinic is right out in the open. It's very obvious what does and doesn't belong here. You can find a little closet with the discarded clinic posters with replacements in a desperate attempt to make it as innocuous looking as possible. This illusion never works for us, but it clearly wasn't necessary. The place has gone from one of medical help to one of disgusting voyeurism. A convicted sex offender running an apparent children's talent agency is not particularly convincing. His desk is littered with disgusting photographs, the source of which you'll be finding later on in the game. A computer in this room has text to a man labeled AV, who asks for specific photos of a little girl and makes remarks that'll raise eyebrows. This goes far deeper than just a small operation in one building. The victims of the past 3 missions have varied. The lives lost in the gas station robbery weren't just done for the sake of killing, merely moving them aside to further greedy intentions. You can argue that the victims of 23 Megabytes and the victims of Twisted Nerve were the suspects themselves, spiraling into their own addictions. And yet there have already been children harmed. One hides crying in a tiny corner of the gas station while another convulses on a bed in a house filled with drug dealers. And as for the streamer map, it is the illegal content of minors that you find in that mission which leads you here. It's an escalation in depravity, with children going from circumstantial victims to the exact targets of evil. The civilians aren't rays of goodness either. Though she won't pull a gun on you, the lady here that you can arrest is found where the children are photographed. She's complicit. This map's level design is a little off-putting, mainly because there's quite a bit to see outside of the main building. Since the clinic is within a block, the game first has you go through a convenience store or through a side door that leads into the inner road. It's a way to force you to look at the area's poverty, yes, but it's also a little confusing to have to clear what feels like a completely unrelated building. After clearing this section, you're led to an outdoor area, and from here, the actual assault on the level can begin. You could also see this as a way to have enemies patrol the exterior of the building without immediately firing on you. The more I played, the more I began warming up to this design. It's got more open areas and harder enemies, but stays small and simple enough to be accessible. For me, the spider was the first mission that showcased the complexity that the AI had the potential of demonstrating. The game attempts to challenge your quick thinking with behavior that might throw you off. Civilians may quickly reach for something which may lead an impulsive officer to fire immediately, even if it ends up being a phone. Even though it's a very readable animation that you'll never fall for after the first time, it shows an effort to create more ambiguous situations, which is at least appreciated. While I don't have footage of this one, I do think that this second piece of unique behavior I discovered was far more shocking. When stumbling upon George Brixley, he has a chance of shooting himself, preferring to die than to get arrested. It was a small but a unique inclusion, and as much as it may be frustrating, because after all, taking him alive is your main objective, it does reflect the man's cowardice. The spider also happens to be the first, I think, big jump in enemy lethality. Enemies have armor and more dangerous weapons, gone are the petty criminals of the previous missions. These guys are on a payroll and we'll see them return in Valley of the Dolls. I would say it's a good level to up the stakes and introduce them, since the actual design of the level is a little more spacious than the previous ones without getting to a point where it can feel unmanageable. There's plenty of space to move around and the building layout is relatively simple, focusing your attention to the new challenge ahead. This simplicity and safety isn't going to last long though, as the next level proves.
Judge will come here. You'll have to. It has to be him. I've seen his training, his methods. I know what kind of man he is. Part of the cycle, just like me. In a never-ending game. I'll show him when he gets here. Show him that he's the same puppet as me. Trapped in the same sick play.
There is no map in the game quite like a lethal obsession. Sullivan's Slope, formerly known as Ridgeline, is a map heavily based on the Ruby Ridge incident, if the Ruby Ridge incident wasn't awfully handled. There's one primary suspect to arrest, and his name is Gerard Scott, a former CIA analyst turned potential paranoid schizophrenic. The game refers to the CIA as USIA, but the stand-in is obvious. Gerard Scott has a burning resentment for law enforcement. What leads you to his cabin in the forest is a shooting, one where he lit a car on fire outside of a police station and shot the officers who ran out to extinguish it. It's when you arrive at his hideout that you can piece together his motive. Sullivan's Slope is incredibly unlike every other location in the game. Los Suenos itself is nowhere to be seen. Scott hides in a house in the middle of the forest. It gives a new meaning to the word dense because the map is in truth incredibly tiny, and yet packed with the most detail out of all of them. The gameplay of this map is unique as well. Rather than centering around a large location brimming with enemies, this is a tiny house with only 3. And so the game does a bunch of little tricks to ensure it's not too easy, at least on the first run. Firstly, the map is covered in traps. More often than not, a door will have a wire that detonates a grenade. This forces you to move incredibly slowly, as you've got to disable every trap one by one, unless you prefer the alternative such as blowing it up from a distance, which isn't really ideal in this close quarters scenario. Obviously, a door being trapped prevents suspects from using them, so in exchange, the enemy gets access to shortcuts. The map is full of crevices of barbed wire and tunnels for the enemy to crawl through, giving them more mobility than you do, letting them sneak up behind you and make quick escapes. You get the feeling of being in the lion's den with every step that you take, knowing that the enemies are all incredibly close by. No one is ever far away or on the other side of a larger building, and it creates this idea of a constant threat with its size alone. The setting makes that even clearer with everything so packed and visually noisy that a suspect may catch you off guard. Gerard Scott in particular wears a ghillie suit, fitting with his paranoia, while also making him blend with the scuffed wooden environment. This map is small, so small that every little noise can set you on edge. Everything sounds like it's right next to you, from the clicking of a strange projector to the buzzing of flies to the creaks that could be structural issues in the house. But they could also be the sound of a man moving through a tunnel. And playing through this map feels incredibly different. Everything ends very quickly, either for you or for Scott and his two henchmen. And it's a refreshing change of pace as compared to the slowly ascending enemy count of the last few missions, and it's one that heavily encourages using deployables. After all, this entire environment is tailored to give you a disadvantage. These men know the lay of the land, the shortcuts make them seem competent and make you feel like you're in far more danger. Sullivan's Slope is littered with detail. In the basement, ricin is being produced with USIA recipes in code, and plans for some sort of spray as a weapon. Crazed audio recordings are littered everywhere, Gerard's voice coming in where his motive is shown. His paranoia is fueled by his treatment from the CIA. It's very possible that the government organization he worked for is responsible for his current mental state. He knows about Judge, your player character, intending to bait you here to show you what he's been doing. He intends to die, to leave a message like a martyr. There is a meaning to Scott's insanity, as there always is. As bizarre and disturbed as many actions may seem from an outsider's perspective, madmen are not simply crazy. They often operate within their own conceived logic with their own justification, even if those are flawed or in truth non-existent. And there is actual evidence across the house of the shady practices that the CIA has been involved with, just as it has been in reality. And yet, that doesn't change the fact that Gerard Scott has gone too far. It's obvious all around you. While the site of meth production in Twisted Nerve was hasty and messy, it was still deliberate and functional. The bathroom was a storage room, living spaces were meth labs, and there were still mattresses in bedrooms. But in Gerard Scott's house, you can see how his mental frenzy has made these rooms devoid of any meaning. Math equations, conspiracies, and ramblings are written on every corner of the house, even the ceiling, like he was pacing around with a pen and wrote whatever thought came to mind on the closest surface. Tinfoil and metal sheets have been propped up on the walls with fencing, as well as the ceiling where strips of them loosely dangle, likely to alleviate non-existent government raids. There are almost childlike illustrations everywhere, from guides to killing federal agents to governmental mask wearers injecting eyes. As much as there is genuine evidence and weight in Scott's insanity, they're trapped within the haze of an insane man's maniacal violence that they become reduced to the background. Scott does not seem like a particularly sympathetic man, and yet he is a man mistreated by a governing body. And we aren't here to help him or to decipher what lies beyond the papers and reports. We're here to subdue a short-term threat, and that's all we're going to do.
Hands up above your head! Police! Get down on the floor right now!
Talk to entry team. Roger that.
The Ides of March is a day of settling debts. Most will know it as the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated, and as you read your briefing, you'll realize that the level being named after this historic day is perfectly fitting. Back in the 4U gas station, you could find a veteran and his dog, both shot to death by petty thieves. On the veteran's table is a sign that protests against a funding cut bill. More of these can be found all across the game, such as in the shelters at the row, and that bill is the reason for this mission's existence. We can't blame insanity or drugs for these enemies. The Left Behind have attempted to assassinate a senator that heavily pushed for the funding cut. They're fueled by this resentment, this rage, the idea that you could risk your life for the sake of your country and for this idea of patriotism, only to be tossed away like an old toy afterwards, regardless of how much you've lost. We are 6 missions in, and the moral high ground that we have as officers of the law starts to become less and less apparent. It's another layer of prevention to the idea that the game is just some power fantasy, even if you choose to play it as such. All of Ready or Not's maps are some sort of transformation, the turning of a normal lived-in space into a site of violence, into an arena for armed men to shoot at each other. Nowhere is this more apparent to me than in Brisa Cove, where the sniper shots were fired from. The map isn't necessarily huge, and yet it's one of the most difficult because the layout actively works against you. These men have fought in wars and survived, and now they're fighting you. It's no wonder that it's so difficult as their training kicks in. These men will flank you, push you from different directions, position themselves in places that are just enough to inconvenience you without being impossible to handle. Sometimes they push you collectively. Like Gerard Scott, they've set up grenade traps on doors, but they are far less frequent, which can often prompt players to forget about them. I know I have a couple of times.
Looks clear over here, boss.
The floor's got a big central room with multiple entrances, which normally has multiple enemies in it, and it is a difficult room to clear, because it opens you up on all sides the moment you walk in. Its length also prevents you from being able to clear it with just one flash, forcing some coordination, preferably a push from multiple entrances at once. Clearing this map is difficult, and more so than any before, it caters very heavily to using door wedges. These simple devices are key. You place them down, they block a door off. Simple but perfect for a map like this, one that is full of doors around this long winding hallway. It gives you breathing room to take a methodical approach, clearing them one by one. There's also the additional complication of requiring several non-lethal arrests, meaning that you can't just gun down every person you see. You could take non-lethal weapons, but with the increased aggression of these enemies, it becomes very risky. One of the deadly highlights of this map is this room, which has a balcony with frosted glass. I can't tell you how many times I just glanced past it, didn't see anyone, and then got promptly blasted when I opened the door. This kind of visual obstruction via terrain is a dirty trick, and once again, something done to heavily encourage precision and checking doors before going in. The added complication of grenade traps makes that all the more evident. There are a couple of civilians, residents of the apartment, that you have to rescue, from a comfortably retired Navy officer to a famous music producer, all with decorated and expensive apartments. The contrast between them and the homeless shelters for vets you find throughout the game is stark. Some apartments are vandalized, and you can find the site of the attempted assassination in one room. Being tasked with finding specific civilians and recovering the weapons used in the attempted killing is a welcome addition, and sadly one that we rarely get to see outside of this mission. It is a hunting game and one with no winners. I was forced to shoot a man who had a prosthetic leg. They may have started the aggression, but with so few alternatives it does feel sad. You're hurting those who've already been hurt decades ago, hurt more than anyone should be for one lifetime. There's no resolution. The senator will thank you for saving his life and give the police station a bit of a trophy reward, but it means nothing. He continues to push against veterans' funding, and the victims of his callous lack of care are either dead or arrested. The level is a sad reminder that bringing order to chaos doesn't equate to justice. The Mindjaw data center is a strange map. It's got its positives and negatives and feels like it belongs smack in the middle of everything when you put it on the tier list. In Sinuous Trail, you follow the crumbs left by George Brixley, trailing the child exploitation ring to this old data center. It's a map I see most often in those John Wick combat demo videos because it really is a map that caters especially well to aggression, with a few notable exceptions. The layout of the office's front half makes for a decently easy experience. It is tight but simple. Mindjaw's highlight is the server rooms. While the rest of the level comprises of decently simple hallways with rooms on the side, the map's back half is a dense 2 rooms full of servers. One is a cube of frosted glass, and one is a massive server room with an overlook from the second floor. There's the added complication of the roof, which needs you to climb up the stairs to access, making this map particularly appealing to vertical action. Gas grenades are the usual go-to for those large rooms, and I personally liked splitting up here, one half handling the upper overlook and one taking the server room. From there we would group up and clear out the roof. Mindjaw's security is armed with helmets and vests, making them harder to kill. They've got pretty cool unique outfits with their black and white security clothing plus masks because of their sterile environment. Because of this armor, my first choice was to use powerful weapons like the shotguns, and doing this also showed me something I hadn't really given much thought into, that being the game's violence. Ready or Not's enemies don't die in explosions of gore like other games. It may not be as bloody and overtly violent as a game like, say, Doom, but there is something much more visceral. Like in reality, you may not see much blood in the moment you shoot someone, but when it starts pouring and staining the walls, leaving a hole in a head or a missing limb, the suddenness of it is incredibly jarring, just as it is in reality, to see a life ended just like that, to see a human body just turn into a husk. Of course, all this is assuming that the gore system works correctly, because in the current build, shooting someone in the back of the head still creates the same gaping hole in the front. It could still use some refinement and variety, and it felt way more consistent back when firing a shot meant a complete decapitation. One of the first questions I had when I played through this was, are these security people complicit in this plot? What else would make them face SWAT head on? But as you explore your location and pay attention to dialogue, it becomes more understandable. The men shout to see your badge. They say, "I didn't know," when you arrest them. These men think that you're robbers because they've been robbed before. These are people on edge, people on their last legs.
I didn't know, alright?
The back area of Mindjot is full of discarded servers and PCs for sale. There's cheap knockoff branding all over the place, reminiscent of the kind of advertising you find all the time when trying to buy stuff online. The company's instability is only further proven via their emails. HR is complaining about the graffiti outside, though evidently they haven't had the time to deal with it. It's not a particularly complicated story, but I cannot deny that it is well presented. There is something admirable about this level's simplicity, about how it doesn't go very far with its story, but presents what it does have in a very competent way. Its level design is simple and pretty alright despite some high difficulty areas. It is, in all, a good level, but that's the most it often feels like. I struggled very much with finding something else to say. The fact that these men are mistaking you for robbers does not make them any less of criminals. Whether they're complicit in the child exploitation is another story, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. And yet, despite all of this storytelling, the game struggles with properly selling it, and to me that's a fault of the AI. You see, every enemy AI in this game has virtually identical behavior with very few outliers. Though they have had certain stats and probabilities edited to fit their character, such as aggression and likelihood to surrender, the actual behavior is relatively predictable compared to the more scripted but specific actions of the suspects in SWAT 4. Some suspects may fake a surrender, but at the end of the day, they almost always respond with high aggression until they're damaged, at which point they'll surrender. If not yelled at or cuffed in time, they will almost always get back up twice, after which point they'll surrender permanently, assuming you haven't already killed them. Though this does make for some tense moments if you're alone and have two people surrendering in front of you, it also makes the enemy much more robotic, much less human. This AI lacks the psychological impact of the many responses that defined SWAT 4. Enemies with guns will always fire at you even if they run away. No one is scared to kill you. These virtual enemies are not human and they don't feel human at all, and so the game needs to use every other tool in its arsenal to sustain that illusion. If it wants to ask questions and create sympathy, it can't rely on its AI behavior, it has to resort to its story, its atmosphere, its visuals. And while it sometimes does succeed, I think it is a sign that the AI really is the game's biggest weakness. The Kauai Beach is one of the most beautiful locations in the entire game, and I'd also consider it to be the site of one of the game's best missions. Ends of the Earth encapsulates nearly everything that I feel Ready or Not ought to be. It's one of the smallest maps in terms of pure square footage, and its story is equally microscopic, especially when compared to the connected plotlines of the other maps. While it is part of the arms trade storyline, it's very much just a little vignette from it. The game knows how to set the mood when you load in. It's a slightly overcast day on Kauai Beach, although the sun is still out. It creates this bright but desaturated look that sells the sort of melancholia the story tries to tell. Your objective is a simple house. As you move up the stairs from the beach towards the residence, you get a sense of just how small scale this mission actually is. The Tran family is modifying and distributing weaponry, and so we have a warrant out for the three brothers. The weapons are going towards a nearby dealership where the gunrunners' operations are, and these boys are in over their heads. What makes the Tran family so distinct is who they're with. The family all lives together in their house along with their retired parents. Their mother is dying of stage 4 lung cancer, bedbound, and their dad is in debt, and so they've turned to this shady business as a last resort. I think there is immediate significance to this family being Vietnamese. Immigration to the United States was quiet until the obvious sudden boom after 1975 with the end of the Vietnam War, and even since the onset of the 2000s, early generations of Vietnamese immigrants struggled in finding jobs outside of blue-collar work. And the generations are on full display here, the ailing parents and their gun-running children. They're people who came to this country in search of a better life, only to be pulled down out of desperation into something far worse. And with us as the final nail in the coffin, it all comes crashing down. Ends of the Earth is a very fitting level title. It's set at a beach overlooking the sea. There's nowhere to run for this family, both literally and in terms of their financial circumstances. It also describes how far they're willing to go to fund their mother's medical treatment. There's honestly very little to be said about the actual level design because this is a very easy one. You get a couple of different entry points, 2 on the first floor and 1 staircase that lets you enter from the second. Though there is a little challenge to dealing with the tight upstairs area, the small size makes it very manageable. What makes Ends of the Earth so memorable is that simplicity. It feels like a microcosm of the rest of the game and what it's trying to say. The Tran brothers are criminals and you're doing your job to apprehend them, and yet they are very sympathetic. By arresting them and maybe even killing them, you are bringing order but ruining their lives at the same time. The parents beg you not to hurt their children as you arrest them. The children talk about their parents as well. The guilt tripping is not subtle at all, but it works. The house itself is crumbling. It's a lovely building that's slowly losing itself. The attic has been converted into a workstation for firearms. The swimming pool is filled with trash, which also surrounds this entire neighborhood. At the backyard, you can see signs of erosion. The ocean is making its foundation compromised, likely preventing the family from selling the house. In terms of gameplay, the incredibly short length of the mission makes it stand out among many other missions with their sprawling buildings and huge hordes of enemies. It's the kind of mission I wish we had more of, and the kind of mission I hope Void Interactive are working on for their future DLCs. One last thing that always struck me was the note you find in the evidence room after the mission. Greased Palms takes place at the Los Suenos Postal Service, and it's quickly gained a reputation as one of Ready or Not's worst maps. Why? Because of this. There is not necessarily much to say on the story of Greased Palms except for one interesting thing, and that is 2 of the suspects. Jack Adams is a FISA aka FBI agent, and he seems to be working with the gunrunners who set up shop at this postal service. Jack Adams needs to be taken in alive. Alongside him is Maria Lopez, who, despite being classified as a civilian, appears to be collaborating with them. It isn't much, but this is one of the few times a quote-unquote suspect is completely harmless, while the other remains somewhat ambiguous. The post office consists of a front desk, a break room to the right, a car park to the left, and of course, the massive sorting warehouse. This level is a nightmare on the first run, and to be honest, I think this map is genuinely impossible without door wedges. Like Brisa Cove, a strategy most people go with is to lock up every door leading to the central area and clearing the rest of the map first. As annoying as it can be to fight through these massive open areas such as the car park, it did force me to use all the utility and functions I had available. For example, outside of door wedges, I made use of banks to clear smaller rooms and smoke grenades for sections of the warehouse. And the patrol through this car park actually got me to experiment with more AI functions for the first time. I may do pretty well without them until here, where I realized that walking as the head of a straight line wasn't exactly ideal for clearing out a location like this. Instead, I went with the diamond formation, which had my team more spread out, letting us cover this open ground in a safer way. And the trick to making this execution work is absolutely planning. This feels like a map designed to be especially unfair very much on purpose. The odds are heavily against you, and so you have to plan very specifically to counter those disadvantages. Planning a route in the pre-planning menu was the last key to finishing the map. How I did was sweeping the front half, wedging off all possible entrances to the warehouse, followed by a careful sweep of the car park and then clearing out the warehouse through the last remaining entrance. It took a lot of attempts, but it did work out in the end. Now, where the issue spawned was with, once again, the AI. Because all of this sounds fine in theory, but in practice it becomes a very different story, specifically because of how the AI clears rooms. Like I've said before, I think that the SWAT AI in this game is incredibly competent, and it is, in the context of traditional room clearing. See, the AI feels tailored to handling medium-sized traditional rooms with doors, but with a mission like Greased Palms, you don't get that many of these medium-sized rooms. Instead, you get this massive sprawling warehouse. The flags for doorways and rooms are still present here. You can order your squad to move through a quote-unquote door to go into the next quote-unquote room, that being the next section of the warehouse, but the issue arises here that there are no doors. The specific doorways aren't very readable, and you can shoot between and through each one. Combine that with a layout this visually noisy and confusing, and the AI becomes very unreliable. They won't be great at clearing the area or following orders anymore. The AI also begins to be weird when following through with your order, which they will do by any means necessary. If I asked my squad to go breach a door and a suspect came from elsewhere and began shooting, my AI would shoot at them while moving to the door and then proceed to ignore the suspect and begin a breach. I think some sort of settings in the event of interruptions like these would be very welcome. The post office itself is a pretty decent visual treat. There are a lot of details to be found, and this map genuinely does feel like it connects properly to its briefing. I can't say the same about some other missions. One of the civilians that we're informed about in the briefing can be found shot dead in the warehouse, almost certainly by his corrupt partner. The car park has some pretty illegal stuff going on in the truck. While there isn't anything crazy or special about this sort of world building, it does feel real. It feels like attention was genuinely put into making this map reflect its story, even if the actual story told wasn't particularly special, and for that I can appreciate it. The only thing that throws me off is Jack Adams. The man is an FBI agent. He shouts at us to drop our gun. He's armed with only a pistol. He is very obviously a corrupt asshole, but I do not like his inclusion. The fact that he is a necessary arrest is not an inherent problem. I mean, we saw the same with the streamer mission. But this objective, paired with a massive horde of hostile enemies with fully automatic rifles, does making trying to complete the level somewhat obnoxious. Jack Adams, despite being a defined character who would probably benefit from playing innocent, works exactly like every other enemy. Once again, the AI rears its head and prevents this level from feeling like a complete solid experience. In all, the level doesn't necessarily have the best or most interesting premise or story, but it does attempt to make up for that with its pretty extreme difficulty jump. It's kind of a test that you've been using what the game's been pushing you to use from previous missions. Wedging off doors, using crowd control, handling large areas. While I do think it's a little too difficult, I would argue that it's a fault of the AI and not necessarily the design of the map itself. And I think that for now I've spoken enough on the AI. The game is still being worked on and feedback is apparently being taken, and for now it will have to do. Refusing to be subtle is not an inherently bad thing. It comes with positives and negatives, and the Vol Health House is anything but subtle. When I found out that Kevin Spacey and Roman Polanski had committed heinous crimes against children, I can't say I was particularly surprised as vile as those crimes were. Big film icons live reclusive lives a lot of the time for good reason, but that more often than not hides an underlying corruption and wickedness that one doesn't get to see when they're out and about in public. Amos Vall is a high-tier pornography producer and actor who worked with George Brixley from the Spider Mission to traffic children. It is his creepy text that you can find back in that mission, and it's what leads us to finally arrest him on the day of his daughter's birthday party. While Brixley's location was dingy and dirty, Vall's is clean and luxurious, and yet it hides depravity just as disgusting as before. The Health House is excessively evil. There's illegal content of minors sitting right there in the bedroom, a statue that implies forced assault, and posters on the wall not very subtly asking minors for pictures of their feet, and others encouraging underage drinking. The level's visuals are heinous, and they're in your face in the most intentional way. As unsubtle and obvious as this is, and as much as the game tells you this in its briefing, Amos Vall is still just as disgusting. None of that is lost or overbearing to me. This mansion promotes such a visceral hatred of him that it's become something of a community tradition to violate the rules of engagement around him. The rest of the mansion is luxurious and beautiful, being based on the Pratchett house in LA Confidential. It's got a private theater, pool, bar, home gym, all depicted with this sterile coat of marble and wood. It's the modern architecture that's always been associated with the wealthy. Every moment you paint the white walls with blood, you're reminded that this man has been living in luxury, enjoying himself as he violates and traffics, hiding himself behind colours of banal rich life. Something as innocent feeling as a flower garden serves only to highlight the mundanity of his evil. His daughter's room, though somewhat exaggerated, showcases the kind of dissonance from the rest of the city these people live in. She can donate unused clothes and clean beaches and offer free tutoring, but in the grand scheme of things, she remains blind to the crimes committed in her very home. It's such a jarring difference from all the locations so far that it doesn't even feel like the same city. Taking Vall alive is the only option. It's a necessity to find out more, to gain more information, but one that's very hard to try and follow, especially since Vall himself can pull his gun on you, shocked that the police have disrupted the impenetrable fortress of his that is money. Vall's disbelief makes sense. After all, a situation like this one is unlikely to happen in reality. Most of the time, people being killed would be the witnesses and victims, as Kevin Spacey has happily proved. It is that same wealth that motivates Vall's private security, who say that they're doing this for the money as you cuff them. I can't imagine how much Vall pays them to motivate them to go toe-to-toe with SWAT. It doesn't absolve them of guilt, far from it given how they're clearly aware of their employer's depravity, but it adds an extra layer of reason behind these vile actions. Valley of the Dolls is difficult, being one of the biggest maps so far in terms of location variety. Though taking straightforward paths seems like the way to go at first, each alternative route leads you to being exposed in multiple ways. Approaching certain stairways opens you to being shot from the windows. Walking into this walkway makes you vulnerable to over 7 angles. The mansion demands that you understand its layout and form an optimal path from there, with cutoffs and limitations that can make it feel maze-like. My runs involved a lot of backtracking. Even the smaller rooms in between large areas are bigger, like the bar. It is an incredibly strong level that never feels like it teeters on being unfair, naturally evolving from the design of previous ones and emphasizing the importance of pre-planning. For example, the pool area outside is large and open, but there are pillars and corners to hide behind, and you can take out enemies from floors above if you're smart about it. This map, of course, culminates right below the site of his daughter's birthday party. Vall has a basement, dimly lit in red, a sharp contrast from how strangely sterile and clean the rest of the mansion is. Hopscotch is drawn on the ground outside with chalk. The sickening implications are confirmed by the rest of what you find. You are not blind to Vall's evil when you raid his house, but it's still a surprise, at least to me, when you get to the dark room full of children's pictures and a mural on the wall showing the true extent of the man's obsession. There are folders with the names and ages of countless children, and of course the barrels. The children's shoes and teddy bear by the barrels says enough. "You're the senior officer," one of my men says. "You tell me what's in those barrels." It is frustrating. The sight is enough to make most players want to go back upstairs to turn the man's brains into a Jackson Pollock. It is nowhere near subtle. And yet, to me, the fact that Ready or Not was able to create such a resounding reaction within their community, inciting such a collective hatred against this fictional character, shows that Valley of the Dolls succeeded.
Don't make me look. Ma'am, I'm not asking you to do anything of the sort. Stay where you are. Oh, God. Ma'am? They're coming back. Stay calm. I'm right here with you. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. No, please! No!
Watt Community College shares a name with Watt High School, the fictional school in the film Elephant, which itself is based on another film called Elephant. The path leading to this level's name is a trail of blood, and every step of the way, gun violence is the constant. Ruben Givi's video essay 38 Minutes 18 Killings Why is a good starting point if you'd like to know more about the first Elephant. Much like both of its inspirations, Elephant has no soundtrack. You don't need music or a video essayist to tell you the premise of this level took root in Columbine. A school map was only a matter of time, having been promoted from the very start of the game, and it's a big one. The choice to use a college rather than a high school allows for a much bigger campus and avoids issues with ratings in stricter countries. Rather than stuffing a large map full of enemies like the Vol Health House, Watt Community College only has 4 suspects. And the choice to have 4 was an interesting decision. If we're thinking in terms of the game, it's not that many. And then you have to consider that Columbine had 2, and that the majority of mass shootings have only had a single perpetrator. The realization of the scale is sobering. Unlike the petty robbers in over their head or the resentful veterans who went too far, these people aren't out to kill just one person or to fulfill any secondary goal. These 4 boys are simply out to kill. One cannot empathize or sympathize with these people the moment they intend to slaughter like this. Their fates have been sealed, whether it be death or permanent incarceration. We can talk about how they were bullied and depressed or victims of society all we want, but the 911 call that you hear at the start of the mission, and the evidence boxes that you find afterwards, vandalized by an enraged parent within the department, speak for themselves. The game does not need to provide an explicit motive for these boys' actions because it's not our job. They are killing people. They have to be dealt with. What is the purpose of this mission? What is the point of Ready or Not? What was the point of the film that this mission is named after? That's a question that I keep asking, and one that I asked the most when I went through this college, when I ran into students wearing backpacks and almost assumed that they were an enemy on instinct because they were carrying extra weight. When I found a ticking bomb in a teacher's office. When I heard a distant gunshot that none of my men had fired. Its design is excellent. It's the same level of quality that was applied to nearly every other map in the game, a natural evolution of difficulty that varies its paces. With such a big map, the hard limit of 4 enemies turns this mission from a fight between 2 forces into a race to stop one. Traversing long distances where nothing really happens reminds you that the shooters are out there doing the same thing you're doing, but in a far more twisted way. Something that struck me very much in both films named Elephant is how completely nonchalant the filming style is during the shooting. There is no glorification, no spray of gore, no intense music, just a slow camera pan that follows along, as if the shooter is just going through their everyday life. They barely feel human, and yet they are. I think that Watt Community College, more than every other map, shows that Ready or Not isn't just a power fantasy, and neither is it purely propaganda. There are questions being asked that are difficult to answer. Wedges, mirror guns, and slow approaches are not ideal here. The clock is ticking, and you've got to move fast or more people are going to die. And now for all I've said about how effective this mission is in its premise, the entire thing begins to feel less impactful when you load in. The school is well decorated. It looks like a genuine college with its lecture room, janitor closet, its many science classrooms, its color-coded blocks. The entire map has this washed out, faded greyish palette almost as a show of stylistic restraint for the sake of feeling grounded. The school is also covered in open house advertisements that create this dreadful realization that the shooting may have begun when the school was at its most packed. And at the same time, there's a blackboard in a classroom that faces a wall. There's a completely empty room within a classroom that serves no purpose other than to hide civilians. And outside of the lecture hall, there is not a single body to be seen with the exception of a bleeding security guard in front. The shock of hearing a distant gunshot is quelled when you realize that the shooters will almost never kill a suspect, only incapacitate them. Sometimes they'll even stand in the same room as them, doing nothing, civilians not even bothering to hide. They may shoot them after a while, but it feels so inhuman. It doesn't help that they have potentially the most predictable spawns in the game, making this mission a drag to replay. We have 2 security guard civilians who just function like civilians. They aren't doing anything special, they're not engaging in firefights with the shooters, they don't contest our presence even once. A chance for complications and additional depth with these guys is lost, because there's no armed NPC in this game that isn't a criminal. Where did the bombs come from? They're not mentioned in the briefing, they just appear in your objective screen, and after defusing them all, you just magically happen to know that there are none left. The idea of them is interesting. Maybe you could call it in to talk when you run into it and wait for them to authorize a defusal. Maybe they could be controlled by the shooters rather than on a generic countdown. It feels wrong to advertise the intensity of the setting even in its 911 calls and not follow through with it, right? Does it not make the messaging feel disingenuous? Is it wrong to ask for more bodies, for more violence? The restraint that Elephant shows is certainly a topic of contention. Compared to many other maps, it isn't really as large scale as it feels or implies. Perhaps that's intentional. Maybe it goes in hand with its desaturation, with its lack of music. Maybe everyone else has evacuated. Maybe you came in a while after most have left, with the shooters just chasing down the last survivors. But as much as I've grown less resentful towards this map and its emptiness, I still cannot deny that it could be more. The sheer size of this map exposes something that I feel the game is sorely in need of. I'm not sure how hot this take is, but I think Ready or Not desperately needs a running function. You could give it limitations and all, but the fact that you can't run in this game at all, and are forced to slowly walk everywhere, feels very strange. Perhaps a sprint could alert enemies to your position more accurately, and perhaps heavy equipment would slow you down. Perhaps you could only do it for a short time and with a stamina bar that slowly refills. But slowly shuffling through with your weapon low while civilians are being shot on a large campus just feels bad. I know Ready or Not is meant to be realistic, but the cops being this useless in this particular situation is a little more realistic than I hoped it would be. The same issue arises with the civilians. The fact that we can't escort them out, that we have to just tell them to run away on their own, doesn't feel right in an active shooter situation like this one. And this is the issue of not having the best priorities. While performance issues may not completely damage the experience, releasing this map with AI that clearly hasn't been refined for the mission specifically, and a lack of consideration as to its own premise, is damaging to the game's messaging. It felt the most like a video game, and that's not something you want when you're reflecting on some of the most painful events in American history. There is much to appreciate on this mission. The time pressure of having to save people is genuinely tense. The game forces you to move forward, to never stop to take a break because lives are on the line here more than any other mission so far. The fact that enemies will actually attack civilians is something that hasn't really shown up yet until now. There is clear potential in Elephant. There is an opportunity to do something truly effective, something that will make us feel how Void wants us to. It has what is easily the most horrifying 911 call among all of them. And despite all that, for now, Elephant remains just a little hollow.
This is Talk. Entry team, we no longer have control of negotiations. You are cleared to move and secure the premises.
While I have gone into a little bit of history and real-world inspiration for a couple of these maps, I don't exactly feel qualified enough to speak on any real-world inspiration for Rust Belt. It is a delicate matter about a country that I don't live in, so instead I'm going to turn to the primary fictional inspiration for this level's visuals, and that inspiration is Sicario. While that film tackles the Mexican drug war, Rust Belt only maintains loose connections to it, instead opting to focus on the Gunrunner storyline, continuing from Ends of the Earth and Greased Palms. Rust Belt takes place in a Rust Belt takes place in a stash house at the US border. The coyotes aren't the problem is Los Locos, the gun-running gang that we've been chasing throughout. They're planning a mass evacuation at this site, and they're going to head through the tunnels, of which we have little to no information on. The map is a hasty scrolling on a piece of cardboard that offers no information on this mission's highlight. The farmhouse is bathed in the desert light. It's not as bad as the Breaking Bad Mexico filter, but there's still a very warm tint, probably due to the sunset. Similarly to Alito Obsession, this map is located far from the city in an unfamiliar environment. For all of its faults, something that I do appreciate from Ready or Not is its location variety, and Rust Belt is no exception. You start off pretty simply in this open parking area and go through the barnyard, where suitcases and beds are laid out for people waiting to go through. But things take a major turn when you enter this small, seemingly innocuous building waiting at the end of the path. The Sicario inspiration becomes very apparent when you enter the tunnels, of course, but I do want to draw some attention to the Mother Mary figure here, a religious icon with a bunch of text scrawled on the wall. It would be easy for someone to dismiss these as generic, creepy iconography, but looking closer, these are prayers for safety and written names. People who have gone through these tunnels want to ensure their safety, their protection, and add their name or prayer to the wall. Though the tunnels are actually very simple to navigate once you understand what they look like, on the first playthrough they are horrifying. The mission tries really hard to be scary, and it almost always succeeds. The tightness and darkness, along with the sound design and howling wind in the distance, makes for incredibly tense movement through. There are a couple of situations where you're going to exit a door and be greeted by two ends of a hallway. It does a very good job of making you feel exposed despite locking you in tight spaces. Combine that with the return of enemy-only shortcuts and suspects that can flank you, and you get what are some of the most adrenaline-filled gunfights in the game. It's like an expanded, fully realized version of the tunnels at the end of Twisted Nerve. But while those tunnels were a little bit of a side location, Rust Belt has them as the main attraction. Because you aren't going to fire your gun in Ready or Not as much as in your average shooter, the sounds are emphasized. They're loud, punchy, echoing through halls and buildings. Sound design is one of the game's biggest strengths, and this level sells that especially well. It creates the same sensation that the use of full auto did in Sicario. Besides the soft howl of distant wind, the tunnels are completely silent, and so the shout of a surprised suspect and the gunfire that follows makes for some pretty brilliant moments. The AI admittedly does rear its head here once again. I think that the way it functions damages this experience with one single factor, and that is that enemies will always respond when you shout in their general direction. Even if they're behind cover or in another room, all you really need to do is shout hands up, and they'll immediately retort back with some sort of insult, revealing their location and making the experience in these tunnels far less immersive or difficult than intended. This complaint extends further to my wish to have more unique AI behavior in general. Maybe they could stay quiet when seeking cover, maybe they could charge you together. Maybe they could actually surrender immediately instead of always needing to be hurt a little. As it is, every enemy works the same way with only a few numerical tweaks, and it damages the effect of what is otherwise one of the game's best combat set pieces. That is, of course, not to say that these tunnels are bad, far from it. The tunnels lead out and culminate in this dark cavern, one with dripping stalactites, a boat, and a dark underground river likely used to cross the border. It's a large cavern, and while it isn't nearly as big as many other set pieces we've seen, being here definitely feels like a temporary reprieve, even if it is the site of the climax. And yes, I know there's some glowing eyes ghost Easter egg, but I don't think Ready or Not needs to further up the melodrama with the supernatural. Rust Belt is a very good map. It has the set pieces and tone, it has the visuals, it has the good map design, but it isn't bombastic. It doesn't try too hard to be dark or horrific. It creates tension through its level design, not just its visuals, and it stays relatively small in scale without being too short and easy. This map is what I wish more of Ready or Not's difficult maps were like. A recurring problem I have with this game is how many movie set piece like large scale missions there are compared to the more reserved ones. But that is more of an issue of quantity, because some of these individual missions in a vacuum are absolutely brilliant, and I think that the next one is particularly special.
This is talk. Entry team, you're cleared to proceed to the hostages. Exercise extreme caution.
Sins of the Father is a thrill. This level is essentially a sequel to Ides of March. The Left Behind have returned, and this time they've taken our senator's family hostage. But where Ides of March very much focused on its moral quandary, this level moves that back for the sake of atmosphere. While the situation that the veterans find themselves in remains tragic, the set piece of this level almost drowns out the sympathy. You could argue that the Clementi Hotel's Art Deco luxury exists to highlight the class difference between the Left Behind and the men responsible for their plight. That's probably true, but I think that first and foremost, the Clementi Hotel exists to look cool. Following from the Sicario-esque Rust Belt, this level feels like a necessary tonal break from the tragedy of Elephant. It's only right to give some breathing room before Neon Tomb. Sins of the Father may have its thematic weight, but what makes this level excel is its atmosphere, and that is what carries you through. This hotel is shrouded in a thunderstorm. Even though it's night, the light pollution lights up the sky in a familiar red. For some reason, the first thing my media adult brain could think here was Gotham. This is neo-noir to me. It is something that looks real, almost too real, too stark, too intense, too perfectly moody. This mission is a power fantasy. The Left Behind have infiltrated the Secret Service meant to protect the senator. They're wearing suits and sunglasses. They shout at you to freeze and put your hands up just like you do to them. They call themselves police, Secret Service. It adds to this adrenaline rush, to this feeling that you're a tier above them, but on a similar footing all the same. The Clementi Hotel has some of the best atmosphere in the entire game. A distant wailing of the Star-Spangled Banner plays, a pretty on-the-nose detail that stays effective. It's a great kind of spooky effect that adds to this level's sound design. Similarly to the Border Reserve, the hotel's hallways are tight and narrow, and so sound feels so much louder. There are a lot of points of interest to keep the hotel from being repetitive, from the glowing bar, to the large overlook with its glass window, to the map's many tight and deadly hallways flanked with rooms on the side, to the exterior balcony where the neon sign lights up the place and rain violently falls. The hallways don't become boring because the level design spreads these out. You may end up in this piano room, in this theater playing an old spy movie, in this kitchen. It could be strange to call a mission like this cozy, but that's how it feels like. Its aesthetic, its atmosphere, its visuals all make this something of a comfort map. You feel sheltered from the storm outside each time you walk past the window. It feels like you're in an environment that's designed for combat, like a whole isolated part of the world is keeping quiet for you, and it does that without ever breaking immersion. The fact that you can sometimes see people moving past the window, that you can hear the distant sirens, makes this map feel so alive. Like every other map, a story is being told. Text messages from a family member to a partner, cameras watching the perimeter downstairs, empty cases for weapons and ammunition is left in the bar. The lounge area has chairs with rope and an angry message on the wall. This was where the family would have been executed. It's not the most revolutionary or special storytelling, but it is the kind of world building through implication that makes certain parts of this game so memorable and appealing. Sometimes you don't need an original message. If anything, this level just rehashes the themes of Ides of March, only to a greater extreme. It's got the same contrast between the abandoned veterans and the luxurious environment, the same American imagery that acts as a critique of itself, the same kind of hallway room level design taken to a greater extreme. And yet it works in almost every way. The added element outside of the setting is of course the addition of the senator's children and family, all of whom are paying for the sins of the father.
This is Talk. Talk to Element. Negotiations have failed with the active shooter. Make entry and clear the area.
Sirens are blaring in the distance, a mess of both police cars and ambulances, giving Neon Tomb a backdrop of utter chaos. As you approach the entrance to the Neon nightclub, you see bodies. These are not the few bodies you find along the way in other missions. They are scattered everywhere. The damage has already been done. The sound design in the first few seconds of this mission is absolutely chilling, and it carries forward in every aspect of this map. It's easy to see how the Bataclan theater shooting inspired Ready or Not's first explicit depiction of terrorism. In Ready or Not, airstrikes in Yemen motivate a cell called the Hand to strike. In such a situation, civilian life is at its most fragile. There is no regret or persuading these men to abandon their ways. Radicalization leads them to slaughter the innocents like cattle without a second thought. There is no time for a moral quandary here. And as you climb up the stairs and enter deeper into the club, a distant, pulsing rhythm begins to play, like a war drum. The neon nightclub is incredibly detailed, and its interior and depiction is handled with sensitivity rather than reducing people to objects. It's hard to ignore the bodies everywhere when there are phones, so many phones all over the ground, everywhere in the map, so many of them ringing, calls from desperate people trying to reach their loved ones, even though it's already too late. As you continue onward, you find the doors are barricaded and massive piles of body have been stacked up. These look unbelievable and off-putting until you realize that these people were likely herded into these corners to be gunned down. The chain on the door was likely placed there not by any terrorist but by irresponsible management wanting to prevent people from sneaking in. The girls that you find working in the club are just like any other person, not just generic background actors. Signage across the club all emphasizes their protection, and said signage has this sense of informality that you often get in locations like these. Places that don't need to water themselves down for mainstream approval or child friendliness. For example, at the front desk is a list of useful insults, discarded phone number cards, and little traces of life and personality that humanizes the many bodies you find strewn about. What you find is funny and real, and that makes the strewn about bodies and streaks of blood all the more tragic. I appreciate that Ready or Not doesn't take the easy way of having these workers be reduced into metaphors of depravity, as the zealots who've attacked this location believe.
I just work here. My coworkers left me.
Civilian cuffed and ready for trailers.
The level has their humanity be shoved right in your face, and it shows how Ready or Not is still able to create some level of sympathy for civilians, even with repetitive AI. It can sometimes be difficult to balance making a level horrifying while making it quote-unquote cool. Keeping it completely grim and horrific is one option, but Neon Tomb instead balances this out. While Elephant is a sterile, greyish and grounded environment, Neon Tomb can often feel right out of John Wick. This does make for some incredibly tense and exciting gunplay, especially with the strobing lights. It creates this feeling like no other when you're shooting at nothing but flickering shadows. Visually, this level is pitch perfect. Neon lights the way for the entire map, but there's enough distinction to prevent you from getting lost or from letting places blend into each other. The aesthetics of blue, black and red make this a very stark and memorable location. The size and enemy count of the map make a slower approach more ideal, but the environment and atmosphere creates this sense of urgency and intensity that made me feel more impulsive, more reckless. The level then combines that with layouts and enemy placement that allow for some pretty extended gunfights. The clearest example is this dining area on the second floor. It's got plenty of walls and cover, but you can see through a lot of the decor, and it's pretty big in size with plenty of hiding spots, making it ideal for enemies to group up in. My battles on this map went on for far longer than most other missions. There are a lot of open areas in this map that are interrupted by hallways and pillars, and I find it pretty notable how many locations link to each other. While there are a couple of decently restricted rooms, a lot of this level is very interconnected without interruption. There are a lot of flanking points throughout. Instead of having a single large open area, the entire club is generally a little bit more open than your average level, and because of that, it's very hard to feel safe. An obvious example would be the staircase going to the second floor, which is connected to this long hallway, which is unprotected and not blocked off by any door. All of this, paired with the loud club music, often makes enemy encounters here far more surprising. My strategy came down to wedges. I cut off as many access points as I could, leaving only one entry point for my team to get in and get out of each area. I felt like I was going in prepared to lay down my life, forming my own linear path which, if I succeeded, would loop back in on itself. Moving deeper into the club, the violence really does not stop. The dance floor is a ghastly sight, and also a place you may want to completely avoid until the second floor is cleared, since it overlooks it. One of the level's most harrowing moments is when you climb up this staircase and turn off the pulsing club music.
Reporting. Roger, entry team. Great work. Keep going.
And all of a sudden, the dissonance between the location and the bodies littered about becomes far more obvious. It creates this moment reminiscent of Hotline Miami, where the excitement of the pumping music fades into an overview of bloodshed and bodies. They may not all be your fault this time, but the effect remains. The fact is that the music distracted me from this violent sight. There is a sense of escalation here on this map more than any other, and nowhere is that more clear than with the bombs you find, not just on suspects but on victims. Civilians have been turned into weapons. It's an escalation that we haven't seen yet, and one that both tonally and difficulty-wise serves as a sign that the end is near. Neon Tomb is horrifying. It is everything that people say it is, and while Ready or Not has never ever been particularly subtle with its themes, it has proven time and time again that sometimes that isn't necessary, that shoving it in your face can be just as effective. And while people may laugh at the apparent absurdity of bodies piled upon each other, I cannot help but see them as people. I cannot help but be reminded that most of these missions have some real world basis and inspiration. I don't know about anyone else, but I think that this mission works. It works in making me feel sick to my core.
You are cleared to move and secure the premises.
Buy Cheap Buy Twice starts off not with loud blaring sirens, nor with a heavy storm, but instead with a subtle, quiet night. Just like the spider, the exterior of Caesar's car dealership is not in its best state. At this point, it would be strange for it not to be. A police car is crashed into this post, leading to the mess of sparks and flickering lights that add to this level's visual style. An inflatable tube man hangs around in the distance, an odd contrast from the drab surroundings of shelters and trash bags that seem to be par for the course in Los Suenos. This dealership is all about the lighting. Most maps have a very distinct visual identity and color scheme, and this one is no different. The building is shrouded in darkness, sort of similarly to Twisted Nerve. Mismatched colors litter the exterior, a neon sign flickers. In the distance and on buildings, old business signs stand around in a sorry state, untouched and unvisited. The best comparison I can make is the film Heat, which consists very much of cold color tones. Despite the mess of the outside lighting, the main color is a deep blue. It's the complete opposite of the noisy red night of Sins of the Father. This night is eerily empty and melancholic. And yet, despite this somewhat subdued silence, this level builds up excitement. It's probably easy at the start of this mission to go along with the briefing and assume it's another illegal arms trade mission. But when you do reach the dealership, a majority of what you find ends up involving human trafficking. The evidence speaks for itself in this mission, and I think it's one of the best examples of Void's capability for environmental storytelling. It is to me far more engaging than finding a horror movie-esque voice recording of the main antagonist outlining their evil plan. The lighting of the interiors here remind me of being at work during late hours, where despite the lights, there's this dim and dismal feeling that soaks the entire place. It's interesting how one of the biggest revelations in the game occurs not in a loud, spectacle-filled shooting site, but in a quiet, tucked-away building on a silent night. Evil stirs not just in the storm, but in the shadows. The silence makes every single gunshot so much louder. It feels like everything we find here is in anticipation. The logo of a spider is illustrated on vehicles that have come from Port Hokan. The spider, of course, is a reoccurring symbol that was used in the child exploitation levels. And with that discovery, we come to the realization that the gun runners, child abusers, and human traffickers all move along the same lines. It is the first time that Ready or Not properly introduces a major narrative development beyond a level-confined story, and it is very effective. In one room we find shredded documents, but whoever was in the process of doing it wasn't fast enough to hide everything. We see profiles and folders full of information on trafficked people. In the room upstairs, we find one of the undercover detectives who's been violently executed. Throughout the level are whiteboards that list down apparent car models and their prices, but it doesn't take a genius to realize that the car models each correspond to a victim of human trafficking. And in one of the most disturbing little additions, the ages of some of them get very low, with their prices inversely getting very high. I particularly enjoy how much detail this mission crams in without harming its variation or level design. The map's layout spaces out these sort of discoveries and encounters throughout without ever feeling railroaded. The service garage out back hides a cache of weapons, linking back to the exterior garage with the Port Hokan trucks, which can lead you towards the first floor of the building with the trafficking evidence, ending off with the second floor and the dead undercover cop. Everything feels spread out to ensure that the map doesn't ever get boring, and you can progress through it in multiple ways while still maintaining a sequence of story reveals. It is also, I think, a very balanced map. Spaces are wide and open, as a lot of these later missions are, but they never get to a point where they are unmanageable. The most difficult area is the exterior car park, but there's a lot of cover to use throughout. The same applies for most interiors, which, despite their large space, always provide somewhere to duck into or behind. The mission has its difficult moments, such as the large display room for the cars and glass-covered stairway that leads to the second floor, but it's never enough to feel too extreme or unfair. I love this mission and how it feels like the night before something big, the calm before the storm. And even though we still have 2 missions between this and the last one, I cannot deny that I felt things coming full circle. And part of that was the level's combat music. Buy Cheap Buy Twice has a very subtle soundtrack. It's mostly just dark ambience until the proper combat song kicks in. It's a song that's become pretty synonymous with the game, a song that played in the gas station when I first started Ready or Not late in 2021. And when it kicks in here, 15 levels in, it is a massive wave of both adrenaline and nostalgia. There's a whiteboard on this map that shows multiple game locations, all of which have supply lines of some kind that converge at Port Hokan. And seeing that, knowing a little about Port Hokan from the old version back in the day, is a very cool feeling. Ends of the Earth was a demonstration of what Ready or Not could be. It was proof that it could do something smaller and more effective, but it never goes beyond that one level. It's a little sad. But this mission, with its quiet night being interrupted by bursts of gunfire, with its simple mission premise turning into something far darker, with its large-scale level design and visuals, with its stellar sound design and music, this level feels like the best of Ready or Not. Everything that the game tries to do just works here, and that is something special. This game can be infuriating. There are missions, like the next one, that had the potential to be so much better but simply weren't. Void has made decisions that I've despised. They've made their game actively worse at times. And yet when they do make something good, I am staggered that Void consists of less than 50 people. That a group of passionate individuals could make something that rivals AAA shooters, and that they can make something as good as this map. Sometimes they get it right, and when they do, it is always worth it. Until, of course, you get to another mission, and suddenly it isn't. The initial version of Carriers of the Vine was set against a somewhat generic Judeo-Christian right-wing extremist group reminiscent of the Branch Davidians. The 1.0 version, however, does a complete 180. The cult in question seems to have started from a women's empowerment group, its members consisting of victims of violence from men. The compound is a twisted sanctuary, a wild display of femininity and pain that's gone too far. Elaine Raskin is a former CIA agent who runs this cult. She clearly has agency, as a cult leader does, and an awareness that lets her see beyond what she manipulates her followers into seeing. Audio recordings scattered around show that she's fully aware of her own lies. She plans monologues and chants for the cult, pushing them to commit acts of violence. Raskin is one of the most evil characters in the game, turning victims into soldiers. The cult is a showcase that initial intent may not matter anymore once people begin using it as an excuse to push their own radicalism. Even the most well-intentioned of groups can be twisted by a domineering personality. The most innocent groups can be co-opted into something far worse, as cults across the world have proven time and time again. And we can see what that twisted radicalism turns people into. They are broken, but they have still killed, and for that, the legal system demands that they be taken care of. It is the most overt example of the game highlighting your weakness. You may be better with guns, you may arrest these people and prevent a short-term threat, but as some cultists say when you arrest them, there's nothing you can do that hasn't already been done. These are traumatized people who have been forced from one abuser to a new one, and possibly even a third after you finish this job. The only time this sensation feels off-putting is that the game provides explicit distinctions between civilians and suspects, even if there is no way to tell diegetically. Civilians and suspects on this map are dressed the same, part of the same cult, wearing the same masks. But apparently we're able to tell some of these people to run away. The distinct difference of the arrest animations doesn't help much either. This is not a problem exclusive to this map. Twisted Nerve had a similar issue, but I do think that it's much more prevalent here. Similarly to Rainbow Six's Oregon, Cherriessa Farm was initially inspired by the Waco Siege, though a lot more grounded environments have been replaced for a cult horror atmosphere, more reminiscent of True Detective Season 1. What brings you to this level is two officers who seem to have gone off the radar in this area. I've seen complaints that they're nowhere to be found, and while I do agree that many levels have a disconnect between their briefing and their mission, the set of graves at the back of the compound are enough of a little implication to me. There's something I want to discuss now, and that is the use of AI-generated art. It's pretty prevalent throughout the game in photographs and paintings, though I've saved it for now to talk about since one room in particular is probably the worst offender. Removing my own personal ethical issues with AI, I can sympathize with Void being a very small team taking this shortcut. Art is expensive. But this is possibly the single most immersion-breaking thing in the entire game, even more so than characters clipping through walls or behaving erratically. This room full of paintings and sketches had the potential to be amazing. These illustrations are meant to be representations of these women's thoughts, their mentality, their psychology. It is an incredibly vital part of the level's visual storytelling. I understand using AI to generate photos of the abusers, but to use it for paintings, for sketches, for these simply bad-looking generic Pinterest aesthetic illustrations just doesn't look good. It is, visually, in my opinion, the ugliest room in the game, and one that I wish didn't exist. Outside of that one flaw, the art direction of this map is admittedly stunning. True Detective is an amazing series, and for this level to take so much visual inspiration from it is very cool. This is a genuinely scary level, and everything seems to play a part. The music is haunting with this ethereal sounding ambience, lacking in the more exciting, almost quirky percussion of other soundtracks, and instead going full horror. The combat stinger is not a sudden aim and break or drum beat, but it is instead something right out of a Conjuring film. The fear is further built up with the location's design. Statues are scattered all about the place, and I don't think I'm alone when I say that the image in the briefing is terrifying. The image of a marble statue just peering through the trees, possibly being a person or something else, is genuinely scary. And I have panicked and shot a statue standing in the bushes once or twice during this mission. They sell the feeling that you're constantly being watched. This whole place carries this atmosphere of mysticism, of something beyond your understanding as a male police officer going through this sanctum of visceral femininity. This is not just a hub for crime or some sort of distribution center. This is a home for these people. It's all they have. They leave their marks on this place more than any other with their living quarters, their kitchens, their shitty AI artwork, their plants and gardens. You are stepping somewhere that you would never otherwise find yourself in, and it is that feeling of being an intruder that makes this mission so anxiety-inducing. It makes a regular room go from a circumstantial environment to somewhere you feel like you don't belong in. All of this pairs with level design to ensure that you're never in a safe position for long. Carriers of the Vine varies itself between very tight spaces and very open ones, with very little in between. This can sometimes lead to this jarring sense of frustration and variation in difficulty. The map can admittedly jump from a complete cakewalk to a huge challenge. The biggest offender to me is the watchtower, but with all of its flaws, it does absolutely succeed in making you feel something. In forcing you between tight spaces and open ones, it never really feels like it offers breathing room. The claustrophobic little rooms, after being cleared, have to be left behind to move into a large courtyard or a wide path or a set of greenhouses without doors. You rarely find spaces that feel comfortable, and it's why, at least to me, this map feels so absurdly difficult. And I do wonder how much of that was a mental block rather than any actual fault of the level design. The level ends with a church. Beyond the farmhouse is a little path flanked by statues and low visibility that leads to this tiny little chapel that really just made me think of RE7. And my god, is this place beautifully haunting. The way the light filters in past the leaves is something you would see in a graphics tech demo. A distant drumming sounds from within, though its source is never confirmed. Inside, we find that the men that this cult kidnaps are slowly bled out, their blood used to feed this tree, with the shape of a woman molded out of it. Shooting this tree plays some creepy ambient sounds. I don't know how to feel about this theme. On one hand, it is viscerally effective. It makes this mission genuinely scary to play on, and the weird cult climax is therefore a perfect way to end it. At the same time, it does make me wonder what the purpose of this mission was. It almost feels a little insensitive to give these abused women, these victims turned violent, into the backdrop for the supernatural. In exchange for spectacle, the theme being carried forward just feels a little off-putting. Conceptually, I like the idea. I like the idea that there is weight to the cult's beliefs, that they know something that we don't. But does Ready or Not really need this? It feels so out of place alongside everything else in the game. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason it's so effective is because it's so unexpected. But I don't know. What is the point outside of trying to be scary? What is Ready or Not about?
Element. Move in. Clear the room. Got it. Left switch. Move down now. Get down on your knees.
Relapse is the penultimate mission of Ready or Not. It lives in a weird space because it's completely unrelated to the rest of the missions, being a direct follow-up to Neon Tomb. The sudden introduction of the terror threat for these two missions can be seen as a little out of nowhere, but I do think it serves a very distinct purpose, and that is to build up the stakes. We've gone from a petty robbery at a gas station to a bloodletting cult with supernatural undertones. The game needs to make the stakes as clear as day. The Coastal Grove Medical Center is one of the biggest maps in the entire game. The Hand have attacked it, rescuing their leader as he recovers somewhere inside. Back in the nightclub, it was easy to let the bodies fade into the background as pumping music and neon lights set the stage. But now things are different. A place of refuge and of healing has been violated. Medical equipment has been used by the terrorists to block off doors and access points. And just as before, people are dead in hordes. The YouTuber Shane Please Shut Up has an excellent video that outlines the exact path that the Hand took in this hospital, a route that can be perfectly traced from evidence scattered about. Because of this premise of following their trail, Relapse takes the opportunity to be much more linear. The map makes up for its immense size with its sense of direction. It very clearly guides you in a single path, quite unlike other maps, most of which can be done in multiple orders. Relapse instead scatters individual encounters and sections in a sequence along a line, and it makes for the large map to feel understandable and doable in spite of its size. The map is laid out as two buildings, one where the bloodbath started and one where things are more quiet. Your path will begin from the first floor up to the third floor, crossing into the next building, at which point you go down to the second and first again. The only difference in choosing your spawn point is which end of this path you start from. The hospital is full of little vignettes, tracing where the Hand went. The most depressing one to see is right in the first building, a retirement party, one very clearly interrupted by gunfire. There is a tragic irony in your last day at work being your last day. I love how this map is able to make every area incredibly distinct, even though all the hallways have the same colors and equipment and aesthetic. The use of visual storytelling outlining the terrorist path allows for a lot of variety. It prevents anything from ever blending in. I almost never got lost in here. The more general, boring hospital area is littered with bodies and bullet holes. The children's section is clearly labelled as such, with its colourful decor and the bomb in the centre being the focus. The bridge of glass clearly connects the two buildings and gives you a glimpse into the outside world. The third floor east wing is empty, a creepy little fact that implies that some people are still here. The second floor is dark, a fire alarm going off with a sprinkler and red emergency lights flashing. The first is the most barren of all, nearly untouched and closed. It's interesting how your journey may go from the noisiest, most chaotic section of the hospital to a quiet portion of it where enemies are still lurking. And you get a very different experience by starting from another entry point which does the opposite. A detail that I think goes underappreciated is that some enemies near the changing rooms may be wearing scrubs. There are little details that make the map feel very complete. Despite the linearity of its floor structure, there is still room for variation. Even though you go up through the floors in a pretty straightforward sequence, the way you tackle each floor is still up to you. The second floor of the east wing feels particularly notable, that being how it feels like Ides of March, with a circular layout and rooms littered to the sides. I am very impressed that the level is capable of maintaining a sense of direction while still giving plenty of room for planned patrols and exploration. The devastation that this group has brought upon the hospital is arguably the most large-scale disaster that happened in this game. While it may not carry as much story significance, there is an inherent horror in the destruction of this place, made even worse by the fact that survivors of Neon Tomb, perhaps even the very people we rescued in that mission, were killed while in recovery here, to survive one ordeal only to fall victim to another. And despite all of the bloodshed, all the violence that led to this, your objective is still to take the group's leader in alive. You don't need me to repeat what the game is shouting in your face anymore. I suppose it's only right to place the two biggest levels one after the other. With the terrorist threat resolved, at least for now, we now move into this game's proper climax.
Day or night, it's just a constant stream. But tomorrow night, that's the motherlode. They got everything coming down to work. I'm talking about the biggest shit that they've ever had. It would be a fucking gold mine for you.
Forgive me for not jumping with joy. Something about this doesn't feel right.
Jesus sweat, man, this is real. The realest thing ever. You've got to trust me. I've never given you the wrong advice before.
I'll make some calls and ask around. If this pans out, I'll be in touch. Now, scram before someone recognizes.
A finale's job is usually to conclude a story, to unify the narrative and the mechanics that have brought you this far. Sometimes it's a victory lap, and other times it's the hardest challenge in the game. Sometimes it's a full conclusion, and sometimes it's a cliffhanger. For Ready or Not, it is both. That finale is Port Hokan. When you load in, you're greeted by a powerful storm. A hurricane is beginning to make landfall. It sends heavy rain falling onto you and your squad. The patter of the rain beats down on your helmet, your weapons and uniforms shine with water. The lighting is perfect, allowing for night vision but also being completely playable without it. Your mission is simple, as per the informant's recalling. An arms deal is going down and you're here to stop it. The port is unmatched in its atmosphere. The way the curtains of rainfall are illuminated by the massive lights is something else. Fighting your way through this mission with the knowledge that a hurricane is approaching is a feeling that no other mission has. The fading logos on brand containers and buildings, the palm trees shaking violently in the wind, the sky a man-made green. This crisis feels nearing on apocalyptic. You begin this map by weaving through containers. You go around some and even through some. One of your side objectives is to open shipping containers that have been marked with a spider. Despite being the final map, Hide and Seek is not a very complex level. It's good and simple, but not the best in the game. It's effectively a bunch of massive open areas with scattered sections of cover throughout, but that quite often works. The difficulty slowly stacks up. After moving through containers, you enter this open lot, which is kind of hell, but there are trucks and little bits of cover to rely on. And with atmosphere this good, I almost don't care about how simple this sort of difficulty is. The map has the watchtower stair climb, which gives a good overlook of the exterior, as well as this little side building and these small offices, but those are just small stops along the way. Port Hokan only has one massive challenge. Within this warehouse is, well, a warehouse interior. It's another massive battle arena, this one with containers to divide it up. Much like Greased Palms, there are borders that are considered doorways here for your AI to go through, but unlike Greased Palms, it's not a visual clusterfuck, so these borders are much easier to see and respond to appropriately. I wouldn't call this mission the hardest mainly due to the quantity of encounters. A map like Neon Tomb or Relapse is going to see far more gunfights, but the encounters themselves are the most challenging on this map, at least for me. It is difficult to handle this warehouse in particular since enemies are scattered around the containers on every end, meaning you may have to split up to prevent a flank, but at the cost of less manpower for each fight. While it can be challenging, it was genuinely fun, as is the rest of this level. Throughout, you're going to be opening these spider containers. They contain the guns smuggled by Los Locos. Of course, that's just what you're led to believe, because the containers aren't just filled with weapons and drugs. In Buy Cheap Buy Twice, you discover the connection between the child abusers and the gun runners, as well as evidence of a highly organized human trafficking operation. It created a link between these two concurrently running storylines. But outside of the hand and the one-off shooters in Elephant, there's one more little series of stories that, until now, felt far less substantial. Those are A Lethal Obsession, Ides of March, Sins of the Father, and Carriers of the Vine. Although they may not all share the same motivations or antagonists, they all do have something in common. They felt like the result of people failed by a system. The suspects and civilians in these missions were victims of a powerful, ruthless governing body, people abandoned by their rulers or worse, actively damaged by them. Gerard Scott's insanity was rooted in something that the CIA or, well, USIA did to him. Cult leader Elaine Raskin was his fellow agent. We play Greased Palms under the assumption that Jack Adams is a one-off corrupt Pfizer agent, that he's just one bad egg. And all of that felt like it was building up to this moment.
Talk. We have a container full of women. We need Thames down here right now.
Copy that, entry team. EMTs and trailers.
This is Pfizer. Stand down and shut that door, entry team. We're sending a unit to secure the container and its contents.
What? We're not leaving them like this.
Close the doors! Unless you want to interfere with a federal investigation, I suggest you shut the door and lock it behind you. Do your job and proceed with your mission. Understood?
Understood. Put the other guy back on. We'll talk later.
No, we won't be. Pfizer out.
Entry team, you are cleared to proceed with the mission.
Of course, they're just asking you to close the container so that nobody gets loose for them to handle later. Right? There's no way that this site, witnessed by multiple officers with cameras, is going unacknowledged, right? And then we get to the last container, the one inside the warehouse. Throughout Port Hokan, the music feels grand, but not necessarily intense or heavy on the action. It sounded like an almost emotional melodic finale. But when you enter this container, the music shifts into a new building tension. Just when you think it's over, it takes a turn. Inside this container is a secret area. There are mannequins, antique furniture, an auction, a room where human slaves are hosed down. You find the auctioneers, Russians dressed in absurd demon mask outfits. As you approach the laptops in the auction room, the people on the other end quickly turn them off and disconnect. It is absurd, and yet it kind of works. I can understand why someone would just find this dumb because yes, it is to a degree. The visuals are evil looking to a fault. But it is not unrealistic in concept and premise, only in its visual execution, and that implication alone is horrifying. Having the culmination of the game's story be pushed aside by a new, unanswered question, everyone still hiding behind a mask, feels incredibly fitting. The visual of these strangers rushing to turn off their cameras, while a little silly, is still scary, knowing that finding these people is going to be impossible. As comically evil as this looks, it still made me feel dread, it made me feel confusion, anger, and it took me 4 playthroughs of this map before I looked up at the ceiling here and saw the spider. It is a sign that you are not in control, that there are forces at play far bigger than you. Despite the inevitable natural disaster approaching, these people, these trafficking victims who ought to be evacuated immediately, are not the priority. We may never see them again. It feels like a commentary. There's only so much a bunch of cops with guns can do in a system so flawed from the inside out, overflowing with so much corruption that even your player character is implied to be something else. Even at your very best performance, you are still just taking orders, and in reality, it's not often we get this kind of very best performance.
Shots fired!
It is never the best solution, but it's what we're stuck with, and that is to bring order to chaos. And that chaos never stops. As I cuff a woman who's already been through unimaginable trauma, I don't feel much victory or relief when the game rewards me with points. Every moment of resolution in Ready or Not feels like a drop in an ocean. And yet we persist nonetheless, because the world could use one less Amos Vol. I can understand finding this finale underwhelming, and they are certainly following this up with updates and new maps. The DLC comes right after the hurricane, but to me this is a perfect ending for Ready or Not. It is visceral, it is powerful, it is creepy, and most importantly it feels neo-noir. We solve the problem only to unearth something worse, something that we'll never be able to handle. And so we report back to the station for a debrief, leaving Port Hokan and Ready or Not to face the storm. What is Ready or Not about? People play this game for the semi-realistic, intense action, but within the context of the story and in reality, that's merely a side effect. Nearly every time it is a grim necessity. Is that what Ready or Not is trying to say? Your job remains the same no matter who you have to subdue, whether it be an abuser, a veteran, a petty criminal, an assault victim, or a man just trying to make do. Even at peak performance, getting high ranks, what you're doing is rarely enough. Bodies litter the ground long before you arrive. The lives of the people you save are forever changed. I'm not exactly helping these men when I'm shooting them and arresting their dying parents. Is it saying anything beyond that? Is it just a post-apocalyptic little shooter that tries to make you feel bad? Los Suenos is the anxieties of the world turned up to 11. Crime rates are skyrocketing and the PD is unequipped to handle it. Power is going out so often that there's a sign in the police station reminding citizens that we simply can't do anything about it. If there is one group that Ready or Not criticizes, it is those in positions of power. It criticizes you as you may kill men who resort to crime out of desperation. It criticizes those like Amos Vol, a monster lifted up and allowed to exist in a mansion while the rest of the city starves. And most of all, it brings attention to those who bend their own rules, those who force you to ignore something that feels like it should be handled immediately, those who are implicated in evidence all across the game. It is not groundbreaking news that these groups kill people, that they torture, that they support evil, even manufacture it for the sake of maintaining power. It almost dampens the impact of individual moments with a deeper implication that it's all the fault of a singular force. But the core concept remains the same, because it's not just within governing bodies. Throughout Los Suenos, you see it manifested everywhere. A desire for power. We aren't bringing righteous justice to the face of evil, we are simply bringing order to chaos, restoring the balance of power to a status quo. What that order represents is the eternal question. The game scatters unanswered questions everywhere. It can be represented well by this one room at the back of the police department in an area that only unlocks when you beat the game. A lone, quiet room, overgrown and dusty, with vintage unused technology and a map of Vietnam. It implies so much, says so little, and there's nothing that can really be done about it. Despite all of this rambling, all of this unanswered and seemingly empty criticism, your actions remain necessary. There is still hope. You are still saving lives, you're given the chance to save them as often as you fail to. There is some comfort in that, and that is to me what the main menu music is trying to say. This serene, somewhat sad song one that feels like the eye of the storm. Ready or Not has a lot to say. How it says it is inconsistent. For as much detail and beauty and intricacy is within it, there is jank, there is laziness, there is AI generated images. There are mature and well-handled themes, and there are bizarre inclusions and story beats that make Ready or Not feel wrong. The AI in this game does not necessarily have hyperspeed reaction time or aimbot. A lot of the time, their fast reactions are reasonable. They've been waiting in the room for you, they hear you coming, they are aware of your position, and so are prepared to fire when that door opens. On the other hand, if you haven't checked with a mirror gun or opened with a flash, you'll find yourself at a significant disadvantage, especially when you consider the need for trigger discipline. The issue is that this just isn't telegraphed. Animations do not have transitions. They just snap from a generic alert pose to the barrel of the gun directly targeting your frontal lobe. The conditions for what should be realistic feel completely arbitrary. A suspect will effectively always clip into a wall when you arrest or cuff them. They still vibrate and flop around like Dark Souls 1 ragdolls. If the game had the time to have such realistic sound that bounces off walls, why does the taser not work like a taser at all? It's little things like this that can pile up. The game's moments of high intensity and design can click in a way more satisfying than any other game in its genre. And it can follow that up with something like this. Every time I boot up this game, I can't help but think about SWAT 4. When I played through 23 Megabytes, a level with a comically stereotypical furry pervert streamer and a horde of goons, I can't help but think about Fairfax Residence, and the choice to give it only a single suspect, and how it showed depravity without ever reaching parody. We have so many signs of how much more Ready or Not could be. If Void had the time to record officers cracking jokes about a coffee machine and a gaming setup, why couldn't we have reports on specific pieces of evidence? Why does an officer say begging while clearly not begging anything? Why couldn't we have moments like the container throughout? Instead, every specific piece of reported evidence pulls from a hat of what sounds like placeholder voice lines. It doesn't feel right to report a convulsing child with civilian wounded and nothing else. It doesn't make sense to say begging followed by leaving a bunch of porn photos lying around. Time that could have been spent on giving civilians, suspects, and officers more personality, making them less robotic in both behavior and animation, is sacrificed for spectacle, for controversy, for scenarios that feel engineered to bait out a Kotaku article. We can admire the beautiful lighting and creepy cult decor all we want, but it's hard to not notice the lack of police perimeters, of snipers or helicopters securing a scene, of pedestrians watching from the sidelines. The trailer units who come in after the mission is done never announce their presence. Sometimes they just waltz in and scare your balls off, and sometimes they just don't spawn at all, like for me when I played through this game for an extra 50 hours to get cinematic shots. I like the game's post-apocalyptic tone. I like the world building of Los Suenos and how you can see signs of its ruin in every moment. But was it worth it? Maybe it was for those who looked closer, for those who hunted for some deep conspiracy lore. But not for the average player. The DLC attempts to rectify some of these issues, but it still feels like a cheap addition. These new maps are the same beautiful visual treat that don't seem to touch on what made Ready or Not so fundamentally interesting. This game is not all bad. For one, the sound is stellar. I think it's what kept me playing the whole way through. The way music stingers will play when you happen upon certain evidence, the way motifs link together different storylines, how the combat themes so seamlessly begin when a gunfight starts. Dan Liston and Zach Bower are incredible, and their work elevates this shooter immensely, as does the sound design team. The game knows how to do environmental storytelling. For as often as it does something stupid, it can do something amazing. Reveals like Vol's basement and the trafficking plans in the dealership feel nearly as effective as Fairfax. The visual architecture of all these locations is absolutely incredible, especially for a team of this size, and the DLC has proven that more than enough. Being able to command a SWAT team, to strategize and execute plans, to vary your approach with so many levels, is genuinely a lot of fun. When this game works as intended, it is a joy to play. But the fact that I have drawn so many parallels to a game that came out in 2005 is a little off-putting. Ready or Not is objectively more realistic, more polished, more believable, but there is nearly a 2-decade gap between the two. It feels like it should be way better than SWAT 4, not just in visuals, which is a given, but in everything else. And it isn't. I think a major reason for all of the AI issues is that Ready or Not is trying to appeal to two different groups. Those being the tactical shooter milsim fans, but also fans of the original SWAT-esque games like the Rainbow Six series. SWAT 4, while having its difficult moments, is a much easier game, and it feels like Void wanted to have elements of SWAT while upping the difficulty for those hardcore realism shooter fans, hence why the AI was so stupidly powerful in the 1.0 release, and why it abandoned the more specific scripted behavior of SWAT 4's AI for the sake of a more generally spread out behavior pattern. But like a lot of PvE shooters, the AI, despite its precision, its speed, its accuracy, often feels dumb. Ready or Not is one of my favorite recent FPS games, but it often misses the forest for the trees. It refuses to show restraint, to ever have breathing room outside of maybe one mission. Its level design, its visuals, its style is incredible. It is so focused on style that it starts to lose its substance. It falls victim to its own limitations. With the release of DLC content that I currently can't access, set after a disastrous hurricane, my fear is that the game will continue trying to make every level like Port Hokan, not understanding that Port Hokan is so good because of its uniqueness. My hope is that future content is smaller, that they take some time to hone in on smaller stories, on mistakes, on the rescue of the innocent, to have more unique behaviors, more special dialogue, to focus on refining little things instead of making bigger ones. The new maps look incredible, they are visually stunning, but is that all that they are? Ready or Not is an amazing game for a team this small, and they should be very proud. But it does have a long way to go. And despite all of its shortcomings, despite everything that I hate, this game can go far. This game has the potential to be a masterpiece. Call me overly hopeful, but I still await that with bated breath. I think they can do it. For now, from my time playing it, Ready or Not is order and it is chaos, in many more ways than it should be. Thank you very much for watching this absurdly long video. By my standards at least, I'm not a fan of Joker. The idea to write it kinda came out of nowhere, and I'm sure I missed plenty of stuff, especially given how the DLC may have recontextualized stuff I have said. I'll actually only get to play it in a couple of months, since I'm actually editing this from another country where I don't have a computer that can run this monstrosity of a game. This other country also has weather I'm not used to, so if I sound sick for 3/4 of the video, that's probably why. I know there's a whole ARG for this game, with lore on its like secret societies, and there's a whole secret subplot with CIA brainwashing and all that, but I wanted to look at this from the perspective of the average player. I'm not exactly the best at the game, so make of that what you will. If you're still here, I'd like to kindly ask you to maybe subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of stuff. And if there's anything you noticed, anything you think I could improve, a comment will be very welcome as well. As much as I love writing my more narrative, thematic essays, there is something very satisfying about analyzing a game mechanically as well, so I may do more of these anatomy type videos in the future, though they'll probably be formatted a bit differently from this one. God, I have cut my voice so many times because I've said something wrong like that for the script. And okay, once again, thank you for watching. The next video will probably be about Hotline Miami. Goodbye.
I only have 2 clips left on my gun.
I have pretty much all of them.
As an American, I feel like I should kill you for saying that.
Not myself.
Yeah. It gives you the countdown in game after you press it.
This is cartoon music.
Oh my god! Oh my god! I just dumped an entire clip into you guys.
Drop your weapons! Get down now! Drop your weapons! Drop your weapons! Police!
Down. Go.
Drop your weapons! Do it! Police!
Bum 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 bum.
Yeah, you're right.
Is that my ping?
I think it might be.
Tree is always the bang. If you
Okay.
have changed it in the lower.
Why is my flashlight not working?
V? Because you're holding a flashbang.
Oh, right, okay.
It's mounted
Dumbass.
Well,
They didn't
fine.
attach the flashlight to your flashbang.
Why isn't it on my helmet? Anyway,
3, 2, 1.
do you want to open it and I'll throw it? Oh, that's outside. Oh shit! Oh shit! Wait, guys, come here, come back down.
I have a broken leg, I can't go fast.
Well,
there's
this
people
just
behind
goes
this
back to
door.
the
I
same
just tried
room.
to open it and they wouldn't let me open it.
What?
There's someone right behind this door. They
Oh.
won't let me open it.
No, that's not a person.
What?
Panic.
Hey, Emmett, check this out.
Oh. Yeah, right, I see.
Wasn't the one who did the elevator, but I did kill these guys.
Civilian is ready for evac.
Oh, it's
Roger that. Trailer
Are we
standing
not
by.
And we're not gonna help him.
Yeah, we're not gonna help him.
And he's still making sound.
Flash.
We'll come in when it's
Okay, he's fine. I'm gonna restrain him now. You shot the guy I already restrained.
I'm sorry, wait,
You
I
think
shot
you're so damn smart.
Unauthorized use of force.
Wow. Wow, vigilante.
I have no idea how this could have possibly happened.